Welcome to Seasonal Magazine's new interactive series on economic revival and policy changes. In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who has been one of the key architects of India's economic liberalisation program that started in the early 90s and who led India's Planning Commission for much of its best growth years in the new millennium. Many thanks for joining us, Dr. Ahluwalia.
Good evening, Dr. Singh.
Good evening.
Yeah, we'll start now.
Yeah, sure.
India went into the lockdown believing that it will limit the virus spread. But nowadays we hear that the lockdown was more for ramping up the health infrastructure. Do you think this has been achieved as infection rates and deaths are spiking in red zones as well as in some orange zones?
Well, look, let me preface my comments with 3 points, which I think we should all keep in mind when we look at the current crisis. First is that this is an absolutely unprecedented situation for the whole world. So, we don't easily have rule books that are tried and tested. So we got to keep that in mind. Second, we're not the only country affected. So there's a lot of experience elsewhere. So whatever we say about things are working or not working in India, we got to keep in mind what's happening in other countries also. And the third is actually, even today, there are huge uncertainties. So whatever I say, please keep in mind that these are some overarching limitations within which you have to look at these comments. Now let me come to your specific question. I know that there was an impression given that somehow if we were to lock down for 21 days, then we will overcome Corona. I think there was a comparison made that Mahabharata took 18 days, this is going to take 21. I don't think technically that was ever the international view of what the role of a lockdown is. I think the role of a lockdown always was to what they call flatten the infection curve and stretch out the period during which infections build up, which gave you a little more time to build up the health infrastructure. So now the question arises, did it flatten the curve? Well, the short answer is, we certainly had relatively few infections during the lockdown period. We don't have the counter comparison, what it would have been without the lockdown. And I think there is a problem that, we're not doing enough testing. So there are big questions about what is actually the rate of infection even today. But the real issue is, assuming that some flattening during the lockdown took place, did we actually succeed in building up health infrastructure? Now, I don't have the information, and I don't think it's been made public, exactly how much was built up, because this would require, what did the central government do? What did the state governments do? I think we do know that some steps were taken, that some equipment was procured, some additional beds were arranged, but exactly what they were, I really don't know. So we're not in a position, I think, firmly to say that during this 2-week period, this is what we actually did in terms of strengthening the hospital facilities. And certainly we're not in a position to say, well, this was enough. Because to say the latter, that it was enough, you have to have some modeling of what the infection rate would be. And I've not seen any estimates of that. Now, this is all to be put into the general cover that there is huge uncertainty. All these epidemiological models are very approximate, and models borrowed from one country may or may not apply in India. So I don't know whether that's a good answer to your question, but that's the way I see it. Certainly wasn't meant to couldn't have been meant to put an end to the virus. The only thing it could have been meant for is to stretch out the rate of buildup of infection in order to allow the health infrastructure to be built.
You had recently opined that hand-holding the weakest sections of the society is an even more pressing issue than reviving the economy back to growth. Can these two objectives be also synergistic?
Well, no, they clearly have to be synergetic. In the sense that the reason I said what I did was that it was quite clear that the lockdown was going to have a very negative effect on growth. After all, the red zones count for almost half the GDP. And the lockdown was virtually complete in the red zones. So for the first 2 months, production in the red zone would have collapsed. It did collapse. Uh, the government has not actually given an estimate of what will be the negative effect on GDP, although I think the governor of the Reserve Bank has said that GDP growth will be negative. I mean, he's right. In my view, we should be expecting maybe 5% decline in GDP this year compared to the previous year. Now, having said that, it's not going to be a 5% decline evenly for everybody. I mean, the negative impact is going to be concentrated in certain sectors and certain states. And especially as far as groups of people are concerned, the poor, those who are employed in the informal sector, even those who are contractual employees in the so-called formal sector, they experience a huge job loss, because if companies are experiencing a big decline in production, they obviously lay off labor, especially contract labor, which is not technically their own employees. So the problem really is that you have a massive negative effect on the income of the poor. And actually that's what you're seeing in these huge migrations that are taking place. People going back from urban areas, back to the rural areas. Now, to my mind, I mean, that is a human tragedy. And definitely we should be doing more to provide a basic income support for this group. But at the same time, we do have to make the economy recover, because if the economy remains totally depressed, then the problem will spread beyond the poor and even affect the middle classes or the higher income groups and so on. Now, of course, higher income groups also lose income, but that doesn't affect their everyday welfare. I mean, their food and essentials, etc. They have a lot of margin. I'm talking about the bottom 30–40% of the population, which doesn't actually have a margin. And they're the ones that are most hit. And I think that we need to do more for them, for sure.
What are your views on RBI helping the government to monetize a higher deficit than targeted on the grounds that this is an exceptional crisis and an exceptional year? Will it cause any serious issues like a run on the rupee, as some critics point out?
Well, actually, let's take a step back before. I mean, monetization of the deficit is just one part of the story. I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is to be clear, what is it that will cause the recovery to take place? So I want to digress a little. I'll come back to your point. I expect that you'll see a massive negative growth in the first quarter. And even though by the end of June, it may be said that the lockdown is now being relaxed, the truth of the matter is that it will take the economy a certain amount of time to get back to normal. So I certainly don't expect to see a recovery to normal in the second quarter. So really between now and September, we're going to have a significantly depressed level of GDP. From that depressed level, yes, in the second half of the year, you may see an improvement, okay? Now, the issue is, first of all, what can the government do to counter this? Well, first thing is that you've got to put an end to the lockdown, because if the lockdown is in place, then essentially you're not allowing supply to increase. Maybe if you believe that you have to control infections and so on, you're willing to take that cost, but then you must be willing to take that cost. But you should be clear that unless we can actually get largely rid of the lockdown, there's not going to be much recovery. So what are the things you can now do? Well, I think that, you've had a massive reduction in demand, partly because people have lost income, and partly also because, export demand is very low, because the global economy is very low. So if you want to get the economy back to something like normal, you have to act on the demand side to stimulate the economy once you started relaxing on the supply side. that's where the fiscal deficit issue comes in. I mean, clearly, government can always spend more if private spending has gone down. That will increase the fiscal deficit. That's not the only thing that's going to increase the fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit is also going to increase because the fall in income and output has led to a huge fall in tax revenues. So you're going to have a loss of tax revenues. I don't think you're going to get much privatization revenue this year. You're going to also have some increase in expenditure. Although the package of 20 lakh crores doesn't have very much of direct increase in expenditure beyond what was already in the budget. I mean, I've seen some estimates, and the direct fiscal stimulus is only about 1% of GDP. Some people think a little more. That's actually much lower than most other countries are doing. So the question that comes up is, should the government be doing a bigger stimulus on demand and living with a higher fiscal deficit? Now, my view is that it is an exceptional situation. People will understand that the fiscal deficit, you can't apply the rules to the fiscal deficit that you would apply normally, okay? So for the current year, you have to allow the fiscal deficit to expand. And then the second question is, how do you finance that? You know, my view is that the debate on direct monetization of the fiscal deficit is a little bit irrelevant. I mean, in the sense that the RBI can, so to speak, support this borrowing, even if it doesn't directly buy government bonds in the primary issue. They can buy in the secondary market, they can sort of transfer some of their accumulated reserves, which is the same thing as monetization, really. And the short answer, therefore, is that this year, whether the RBI monetizes or doesn't monetize is less critical than what's the size of the fiscal deficit that you can tolerate. And I think indirect monetization is going to take place, and there's nothing wrong with it. What I think that doesn't mean, by the way, that this is not a problem. Because after all, if our capacity to produce GDP is permanently impacted, then we cannot expect that we'll maintain everybody's income and consumption at last year's level. But if what we're saying is that, look, it's been impacted this year, and let's say from next year onwards, we are going to get back to some sort of reasonable norm, then what the rating agencies need to know is that, look, if your fiscal deficit is going through the roof this year, and it will go through the roof, what are you going to do about it next year? Is it going to continue in that way? Now, here you have a problem because we don't have a very good reputation for maintaining our promises about bringing the fiscal deficit down in future years. I mean, this government and also the previous government kind of failed to keep up to those promises. But you know, what is past is past. You have to put across a credible picture that although the fiscal deficit is higher this year, we're really going to bring it down next year. If that picture is credible, then I think rating agencies will understand that this year is not the thing to watch at. The thing to watch at is, are we going to do what we say we're going to do for next year? And I personally think the government would be much better off coming clean on this issue and saying, look, for a variety of reasons, the fiscal deficit is going to be much higher, but we promise you we're going to bring it down, and this is what we're going to do to bring it down. And I don't think they've taken that line today. I mean, for example, there's a lot of talk that we're going to borrow maybe 2% of GDP more. But you know, that's not going to be enough because the decline in tax revenues alone will take up that space. So we're going to have more fiscal deficit increase than is currently being accepted. And you know, if the RBI refuses to monetize it, it just means that interest rates will shoot up. Because I don't think that a huge fiscal deficit can be easily financed by bringing in money from outside, because money coming in from outside will look at the macro situation. So I personally think that the RBI should not object to indirect monetization of the deficit, and that's what's going to happen in due course.
Thank you for the very detailed reply. The lingering images from this crisis have all been of the migrant laborers. Do you think this could have been better managed by allowing them a week's time to get to their native places before imposing the lockdown?
Well, it's always, as I said, because there's no rule book. I mean, whoever organized the lockdown didn't really have a rule book that they could go to. But that doesn't mean we should not, in retrospect, try to see what could have been done better. Certainly, I think that we could have given warning. There was no merit whatsoever in imposing the lockdown suddenly. In Bangladesh, they gave 4 days warning. In South Africa, 4 or 3. South Africa similarly had a lockdown. They gave 2 or 3 days warning. In an environment where people are away from home and where a lockdown is going to prevent people from moving, it makes sense to give warning. I mean, the idea of a warning is that it enables people to decide what they can do, and those that really have to get back home, get back home. So I think that could have been done a lot better. I also feel that, if we had made very clear what the consequences of a spread of infection would be, there would have been less of a panic that we have seen. And it wasn't clear what would be the consequences of getting infected. And certainly the idea that, if you got infected, you would be quarantined in some government facility, and what our impression of government facilities is, that would be enough to send people back home anyway. So I think, yes, it should have been much better managed. But it's also true that, there isn't a rule book. So in the absence of precedent, these kinds of things happen.
Now, with the reverse migration having taken place, do you think it will be a major roadblock in getting the economy to work again?
I think that will be a roadblock, in the sense that when people move, there are some fixed costs to moving. And there's also a huge uncertainty about moving back. I mean, in the sense that I'm pretty sure the migrants will ultimately come back. But, right now, nobody is quite sure when the relaxation proceeds, if the infection rate shoots up, what is the government going to do? I mean, are they going to reimpose a lockdown? Now, as long as there is a fear that, you might get caught in a second lockdown, people are not likely to move back easily. So I think we have a problem in the sense that you may have people who want to move back, but they will not move back suddenly. And therefore, the return to normalcy in terms of getting your labor force back will be more problematic than people think.
Many economists, including Dr. Abhijit Banerjee, have opined that this is the perfect time to implement a universal basic income of rupees 1,000 or rupees 500 per month for all Indians, and that without such a measure, India is set to go into a deep crisis. Does India have that kind of money, and is this feasible?
Well, as a general rule, I am not in favor of making permanent institutional changes to deal with what is a current crisis. I mean, current crisis is a serious crisis. If we take a look at all the different instruments we have for providing more income to the poor, we can do a lot more than what we are doing already. Okay? Whether there is a case for a universal basic income is a longer term reform. And virtually everybody who has argued for a universal basic income, what they've said is that if you get rid of all the useless subsidies you have and convert it into a universal basic income, the country will be better off. But by the way, I'm inclined to think that even then, I'm not sure that a universal basic income, in other words, an income that everybody would be entitled to, is really the answer. Remember, almost no country has it. So, I mean, to my mind, a poor country that has fiscal problems, committing itself to a universal basic income without abolishing any subsidies, I don't think makes sense. But I do think that if you made a list of the 10 or 20 different schemes that we already have, and each one of them is leaky, and you just said, look, we're going to do more for the poor. Now, these are targeted schemes. They do not reach out to middle income or taxpayers. They're only meant for the poor. Yes, there are leakages. Some people who really aren't poor benefit, and some people who are poor don't benefit. But in the middle of a crisis, I am not convinced that we should be making what is actually a structural change for the future. That is something we should think about when we go back to a normal situation. And exactly when that will be is also not very clear. Because remember, if we go down by 5% GDP in the current year, which I think is very likely, then, by next March, some degree of normalcy on this will have, on the health side, will have got restored. When I say normalcy, I don't mean that there will be no infection, but people have got used to it, okay? So from that level onwards, you may get a rebound. I mean, instead of a minus 5% this year, the economy may grow at 5% compared to the current year. But that'll only take you back to where the GDP was in 1919-20. That means in the year 21-22, the GDP will only go back to where it was in 1919-20. So a 5% growth next year should not be counted as a sort of return of growth. It's only a recovery to a more normal level of production. The real test of whether we've gone back is what happens in 22-23. And that is really going to be the difficult part. I mean, can we get back to the sort of high growth rates that we've had in the past? And, we have had periods when we grew over 8%. We've had a longer period when we grew at about 7.5%. Then it slowed down. I would say as of now, the longer term growth potential for India is lower anyway, because the global growth potential is lower. The world is entering into a somewhat different set of policy configurations. A lot of the openness and the globalization that encouraged more efficient developing countries to expand their markets will not be available. So, grown at 7.5%, let's say in earlier years, we probably won't be able to grow at 7.5%, but could we grow at 6.5%? Now, on present prospects, I'm not even sure that we can do that. So our job right now should be to work out what is needed to get the economy at least to grow at 6.5% in 22-23. And there are many things we have to do to make sure that that happens.
What are your views on the rupees 20 lakh crore package announced by the government? Is it really a stimulus, or will some parts of it work like a stimulus at least?
You have to decide what is the definition of stimulus. I mean, if your definition of stimulus is that, look, additional expenditure beyond the level that was already built into the budget is what you call stimulus, then the stimulus in this package is much less than 20 lakh crore. Almost all of the 20 lakh crore is a projection of credit that will be given through the banks based on liquidity that's been injected by the RBI and some credit guarantee schemes to businesses. Now, expanding credit for business is a good thing. So I think from that point of view, I would compliment the Reserve Bank of India that on the liquidity side, they have done what is necessary. But that by itself does not ensure recovery. I mean, look, if a business is broke and not making money and not facing any demand and losing cash, and you give it a lot of credit, it's just going to end up with a debt service burden which it can't sustain, and it'll default on these loans. The fact that the credit is guaranteed by the government is a comfort to the banks, but it doesn't necessarily contribute to reviving the economy. So I think that the credit is good, but I don't call it a stimulus. What we need for the stimulus is a much broader set of measures that would get the economy back on track. And I think a lot of that has to do with stimulating demand. A lot of that has to do with restoring trust that private investment can pick up, improving the ease of doing business, and implementing many of the reforms that have been talked about now for several years, but have not actually been implemented. Now, the government has mentioned some of them, and let's see whether they're able to do it or not.
Okay, you answered that question very clearly. You are heading Punjab's Advisory Council for Strategies to come out of this crisis along with Dr. Manmohan Singh. Are Punjab's current issues comparable to other states? Do you think the center needs to do more for the states as they have been the ones on the front line fighting this crisis?
Yeah, let me clarify. The Chief Minister asked me to head a group of experts to advise Punjab on what he calls their medium and longer term strategy once the COVID crisis is overcome, how to get the Punjab economy growing rapidly. Dr. Manmohan Singh, he has said, is advising him separately. Dr. Manmohan Singh is not a part of my group, but I'm sure that he is giving a lot of advice to the Chief Minister. We have not yet submitted our report, so it's a bit preliminary for me. But we are going to look at what Punjab needs to do. Is Punjab in a similar situation to other states? Well, all states are different. Punjab, Punjab used to be the number one state in the country in terms of per capita income. And, for the last 10 years, it's been slowly losing ground to other states. So frankly, I think Punjab's long-term objective should be not to get back to the performance that it had before the COVID crisis, because that performance was causing Punjab to slip. Punjab's objective should be how to get back to grow faster than the rest of India, if it can. And we're kind of trying to raise the sort of issues that are relevant for Punjab to achieve that objective. Should the center do more for the states? Certainly it should. Because look, the states do not have, we know that in our federal breakdown, if you like, taxation breakdown, most of the expenditures that governments have to undertake are expenditures that are done by states, health, education, also social benefits of various kinds and so on. Whereas most of the revenue actually goes to the center. Then, of course, there is a finance commission mechanism for sharing the divisible pool of taxes with the states. What has happened right now are two things. One, the central revenue is going to be much less than was projected when the states' budgets were formulated. The central government projected a growth rate of GDP of something close to 7% in real terms, and it's going to end up being -5, I think. So this means that the revenue that was projected and on which shares were decided for the states is going to be much less than was earlier expected. So the question arises, should the center compensate the states for this shortfall? I think the center could do that if it was willing to increase its own fiscal deficit. But what the center has done is that they have said, well, we'll let you borrow. And they've done that. So whereas earlier the state's deficit was capped at 3% of GDP, now it's being capped at 5% of GDP. So the states are allowed to borrow more. But the states have very high debt obligations. And to my mind, if they're losing direct revenue grants that would have come from the center and simply being allowed to borrow, that's not an equivalent compensation. So I think that is a little unfair. The Chief Minister of Punjab had said in a letter that he wrote to the Prime Minister that the central government should give a COVID-19 grant to the states to compensate for the revenue loss, and actually to tell the Finance Commission, which is supposed to submit its report for the next 5-year period this October, to go back to its calculations, recommend what additional grant should be given, raise that money through borrowing, give the grant, and postpone the longer term Finance Commission 5-year recommendation to 1 year later. I don't know what decision, if any, has been taken on that, but I think that's an important issue. The second thing you have to remember is that the GST, which I mean, we all think conceptually is a good tax, takes away from the states their taxation capacity. They no longer have, I mean, what used to be a state's tax cannot now be increased by the states. It can only be increased by the GST Council. And I think the shortfalls in the GST revenue are huge. So really the states don't have the sort of leeway to make up revenue, and therefore they need more assistance.
Based on your book, Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years, and as an architect of the reforms in those days, do you think India can ever go back to such a high growth period again? What would be the imperatives for that to happen?
Well, that's a tough question because, you know, right now our big challenge is how to get back to the GDP of 1919-20, because we're going to be 5% below that this year. And even if we grow by 5% next year, we'll still be back at 1919-20. However, there's no doubt, I say that in Backstage, that in that long period, the UPA was in power for 10 years. The first 7 of those years were outstanding. The last 3 of those years, growth slowed down. It was still positive, but it slowed down. Now, you know, if you look at those first 7 years, the growth rate was over 8%. And we were all very enthusiastic about it and positive and so on. And then the growth slowed down. I mean, some slowing down was unavoidable. Nevertheless, you know, over the 10-year period as a whole, 10 years is a long time, the economy grew at 7.6%. Okay? It's never done that before. But that was a period when the global economy, except in the last couple of those years, was actually doing very well. So can we go back to 7.6%? You know, it all depends on how determined we are to fix our own problems. Because India has a lot of unutilized potential productivity gain if India does the reforms that are necessary. And the real question is, are we willing to do those reforms? Do we know what those reforms are? And is there a political consensus? Now, I would certainly say that, you know, in the medium term, in order not to be unrealistic, we should set a target of trying to get back in the year 22-23, trying to get back to somewhere between 6.5% and 7% in 22-23. I think if we do that, that'll be a pretty good start. And then we can see how we can go further.
Okay. Would you agree to the fact that the finance ministry faces a conflict of interest when allocating funds to various ministries, since they are also responsible for maintaining the fiscal deficit? Moreover, without financial authority to disperse funds, does Niti Aayog run the risk of losing credibility?
I honestly don't know what my understanding is that Niti Aayog doesn't play any role in financial allocation. So I don't see that credibility is involved since they're not involved. You know, in the old days, the Planning Commission was the institution that discussed with every ministry what is needed in terms of expenditure. And then the Planning Commission would discuss with the Finance Ministry, which would say this is the money available. And the two together would advise the Prime Minister who would make the final decision. I think that process no longer exists because the Niti Aayog does not get involved in financial allocation. So this whole issue is somehow decided now between the Finance Ministry and the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office. So I have no idea how that actually functions. You know, when you say conflict of interest, governments should manage conflicts of interest. I mean, whether you do it through one mechanism or another. All governments are faced with conflicting objectives, and the sign of successful government is that you give weightage to those objectives and take a correct decision. I don't think I view the Finance Ministry's job as simply controlling the fiscal deficit. I mean, after all, in certain circumstances, the real job of the Finance Ministry is to determine what is the optimum fiscal deficit. The optimum fiscal deficit is not a balance. So there's a real question, what do they regard today as the optimum fiscal deficit? Personally, I feel they should come out and say so. So at the moment, we've not had that. And I think if somebody were to bring up that case, this is what we think, this is what we're going to do, then we can have a debate on it.
Due to the pandemic, there is an absence of much actual data, and quarterly GDP estimates are based on more assumptions than ordinarily used. The provisional estimate of Q4 growth rate is of 3.1% released by the Ministry of Statistics.
Yep.
Do you consider it as an overestimation like many others? And is it in the continuation of the data quality issues regularly faced by the NSO or specific to the current pandemic situation?
No, I think I'm sure that the pandemic has made life more difficult. And I mean, I don't know how they're handling it, but we should accept that. However, I think on the data side, we do have a problem. I mean, and I mentioned this in Backstage. India's statistical system had a very high reputation for being independent of government and providing the best estimate that is possible of GDP. And I think that over the last several years, that independence has gone down. And it looks increasingly as if, and many people have criticized this, looks increasingly as if data is held back if it is not suitable, or if it doesn't present a picture which is positive. Now, this is a disaster, because this is like trying to treat a patient after breaking the thermometer. So you really can't measure the temperature. I don't know what the data will be later, but if you look at the revisions that have been made quarter by quarter to the Indian GDP in the last several quarters, every 2 quarters later, the previous 2 quarters GDP is lower. Whether that will continue or not, we have to see.
With your permission now, Dr. Singh, can some of our participants ask the questions?
Yeah, sure, of course.
I invite Dr. Madhukar Angur. He's the founder chancellor of Alliance University, Bangalore.
Uh-huh.
You have something to ask Dr. Singh?
Yeah, go ahead. I can't hear.
Carl?
Can you hear me, sir, now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, I am from the education sector. Again, it's an honor to be able to interact with you. I obviously have been involved with education, higher education particularly, for literally a few decades now. With this pandemic, you are very well aware, a lot of sectors have been affected, one of which has been the higher education sector. How do you see this this pandemic unraveling itself in terms of the future of education across all levels? I mean, there are obviously different modes of delivering, but then we are moving more and more towards online or distributed ones. But then how do you perceive this to have an impact on higher education is my first part of the question. And there's a follow-up to that. I request your response on that, please.
You're going to give the follow-up now or after I answer?
I'll wait for that.
All right. No, sure. No, this is it's a very good point that you're making. And I think I'm not knowledgeable. I've never run a university. But I talk to people, including people abroad. And I think universities abroad are thinking very hard that, they have really never got away from the brick and mortar campus style of education. And there's a lot of socio-cultural, if you like, preferences, or you want to call it baggage associated with that. I mean, kids go for 3 years, they bond, they need to be in a campus, the campus must be attractive, and all of that kind of thing. On the other hand, you now have technologies that allow you to, as it were, exchange thoughts with your teachers and even get educated without any of this. And I think for several years, people have been saying that the top universities of the world will have to change. But, and the pandemic will only make that even more so. Because frankly, one of the problems is that even after we've declared that the pandemic is over, there will be a resistance to gathering together in large crowds. I mean, these fears, once they are created, are very difficult to get over. Now, once we have a vaccine and a cure, and people all get vaccinated so that they don't feel too vulnerable, then it may change. But that could well take a couple of years. And a couple of years is to get the vaccine identified and proven. getting coverage will take even longer. So I think we are going through a period where all kinds of new methods of education will be experimented with. This is not just an issue of new methods of education. It also affects the reach of a university. I mean, the number of people that can be taught through this method and how the best lecturers can somehow reach out to people is a revolution. And I honestly don't know what the impact would be. But if I were running a university or responsible for a university, I would put a lot of high-level input into thinking how it's going to change. But most of all, I will also look at what others are doing. I mean, as I said right at the beginning, we're not the only country facing this problem. So I think our universities should be better informed about what's happening elsewhere. I mean, what is MIT doing? What is Harvard doing? What is Princeton doing? Etc. Part of the problem in big universities is that they are used to very high remuneration for the top professors, which you recover through very high student fees. And it's quite possible that that may no longer be feasible because funds are drying up, government funds are drying up. So what these universities will do to reach out, we have to see. My guess is that in India, I mean, the regulatory system should encourage innovation and competition. Look, right now, are you running private university or a state university?
It's a private university, sir.
Okay. Now, if you're running a private university, my understanding is you're allowed to do online education, distance learning, but only within the state where you're accredited. You're not allowed to do it if somebody wants to in another state. Whereas technically, if you established in Bengaluru a degree of excellence and somebody in Punjab wants to get educated, they should be allowed to do that. Now, there is no reason why these antiquated, antediluvian regulations, sort of a license permit Raj, should be allowed to continue. But, who's to raise this issue? I mean, it's very difficult to change, but I think these are issues that should be taken up and change brought about.
Yes, sir, I fully agree with you. And one of the things that I believe ought to happen is, again, we have focused a lot more on research and dissemination of knowledge and so on, which typically universities or institutions of higher learning do. And universities worldwide also have been focusing on that for decades now, as you know. Now, when you look at the unemployment rate, for instance, in the United States right now, it is alarming. As you know, 40 million plus people are unemployed and so on. And even what we have seen in India bothers all of us, particularly the migrant laborers going in scores and scores. So one of the aspects that I and a few other colleagues of mine have been thinking, and I have written some papers also on this, is when we look at organizations, typically there are three types. There's a critical genius component, there is a specific skill component, and there's an easy to fill component in terms of how manpower is distributed within organizations. We have to be doing more of at least a specific skills component, because the easy to fill components are the ones who are getting laid off so easily. And so I think universities have to reorient themselves into actually building specific skills, maybe short-term training programs and so on. So I wanted to get your views on this, sir, because we have always focused on degree-oriented programs, which typically take several years, depending on the program and so on. So I wanted to seek your input on that as well, sir.
Well, again, it's not an area that I'm knowledgeable about, but I generally agree with the proposition. First of all, the case for short-term courses derives, if nothing else, from the fact that the old style of education, that is, you get educated between the ages of 18 and 21, and after that you don't learn anything and just go into a job and keep learning. Well, it is no longer true. I mean, people are going to switch occupations. I mean, there's still a case for a basic degree. So I wouldn't say that we should get rid of basic degrees. But people will have to learn to keep acquiring skills. And, we underestimate what this means. Look, my grandson is 10 years old, and he knows more about my iPhone than I do.
Sure.
So I'm clearly not adequately educated in being able to use this technology. So we need to have a lot more of that. And I mean, universities need to do that. My feeling is that universities will respond quite quickly if the demand in terms of employability surfaces. What I'm not very confident about is leaving the universities, particularly just the state universities, public sector universities, to determine what is the right skill. Because there are huge vested interests in declaring that certain skills are important once they exist. So I think we need to create flexibility where different kinds of skills are taught, and we leave it to the market to determine who's going to take up what courses.
True, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, many
Thank
thanks.
you. Thank you, Dr. Angu. Thank you, Dr. Singh. I now invite Mr. Sudhagar Rao, who is Director of Branding at ICFI Group, Hyderabad, to ask this question. Dr. Sudhagar Rao.
I don't see him on the screen.
He's just joined us.
Ah,
Good evening, sir. Can you hear me?
no, hi, yeah, I can hear you.
Good evening, sir. It's a great opportunity to get connected to you on this Zoom call. I am from ICFAI. We have about 11 universities, 9 business schools, 7 tech schools. We are present in roughly about 20 locations in the country. Sir, my question is not about education. Recently, I have been involved in some relief activity for these workers, interstate and intrastate workers, in the issue that we all have seen. There's been a lot of humanitarian crisis. And yeah, so the biggest question, I met roughly around 7,000 to 8,000 migrant workers personally, and the misery out there appeared to me as too huge and too large and very, very difficult to fathom. Sir, as an economist, do you suggest, because as per 2011 census, the number of migrant workers was put at 45 crores. And then there are various layers and categories and descriptions in that. And today, 10 years down the line, we don't think, and that is the biggest problem, that we don't know how many of the migrant laborers are existing across the country. As a seasoned economist, what would you suggest? What kind of mechanism that ensures that we know how many are there in which location, and therefore any subsequent administrative relief activity can only begin based on this number or this estimation?
To be honest, I've not thought enough about this. I know that a lot of people are worrying about that. I know in Punjab, for example, they have similar problems of not knowing how many migrant workers there are. I think we need to step back a little and ask ourselves that why has the migrant worker problem arisen? I mean, for example, between 2 workers who do an identical job in a factory, and one comes from a rural area within the state, 30 miles away, and another comes from a rural area in a different state, which may be maybe 100 miles away. The first guy is not called a migrant, but the second guy is called a migrant. So I'm not sure what is the entitlement that we are thinking of. Are we going to have different entitlements if you're a migrant or not a migrant? Or should you be having uniform entitlements, whether you're a migrant or not? And then sort of stretch out the relevant social safety net across the board. See, I think focusing on migrants alone, it's like as if, I mean, they're not citizens. I mean, they're all citizens of India. We're just calling them migrants. And in many of the larger states, I mean, for example, in a state like UP, I mean, you could have come, if somebody from East UP goes to Noida, I mean, which is next door to Delhi, he's not a migrant under the census definition, but he's still in his own state. So I think that we need to be clear. We need to be clear, why did the migrant workers suddenly get uprooted? uproot themselves and create this problem. And I think obviously there was either a lack of trust in something, or they felt that their rights would not be protected. And I think if we could establish a situation where they would not have felt this lack of trust, they would have stayed where they were. And then the question would be, how do we look after them and so on? And that's a relevant question. I mean, whether someone is sick or not sick. I mean, did they have the feeling that if they fell ill in an urban area, but they didn't come from the same state, they may simply not be looked after. Whereas if they could go back home to their village, they would be looked after. So, I mean, we need clarity on that. I think we have a major problem of lack of a social safety net, but that's there for both migrant and non-migrant.
Yes.
I think we certainly need to strengthen that basic social safety net. It's probably true that a migrant whose family home is hundreds of miles away feels more insecure for any given social safety net than a person whose family home is only 15 miles away. But that we can't do very much. Where you can't have a system where because you're a migrant, you're getting privileges which a non-migrant working in the same company doesn't get. So that's the thing I'm struggling with, and I've not got a good answer.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your response.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatt. Ms. Sujarita Saha would like to pose a question to you.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, sir. This is Sucharita here. So I'm a student right now pursuing my MBA at IIM Ahmedabad. So, sir, you mentioned during the talk that India, in order to pursue its growth story, should achieve or should target to achieve at least 6.5–7% of growth in fiscal year 2022-23. So, sir, the question that I want to ask you is that you will also agree to the fact that the kind of recovery that the economy is seeing depends on, the kind of measures that are taken after the lockdown is, opened up. So, and we also know that India has imposed one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. So, how would you predict the recovery between countries which have imposed a stricter lockdown vis-a-vis countries which have not? Like, what will be your 2 cents about it?
When you say, I think some group in Oxford have made some calculations that on those calculations, we are deemed to have a very strict lockdown. But actually, you need to ask yourself, is it being implemented that strictly? So I think if you were to adjust the provisions of the lockdown against the actual implementation, I doubt if it's being implemented that strictly. That's the first point. Second, a lot of the research that's being done, and I've seen the odd paper, there doesn't seem to be any clear relationship between the strictness of the lockdown and the beneficial effect. Not very clear. I mean, there are places in Europe that have been very strict, and there are places that haven't been very strict. And I think a lot depends actually on whether the habits of the individuals achieve social distancing. Now, let me give you an example. I mean, if we are living if 40, I don't know about Ahmedabad, but let's say almost 50% of Mumbai cars live in slums. If 40 to 45 to 50% of the people live in slums, and they live 8 or 9 people to a room, then what a lockdown means is that you can't go out and you've got to stay in the room with another 8 or 9 people. That's very different from what a lockdown does in Germany, where lockdown means that you're restricted to your house and you're effectively achieving social distance because you have far fewer people and you can stay away. So I'm not really sure that our so-called anyone thought about what this strict lockdown would mean in practice. And for the reasons I'm saying, it may not have led to the effect that you expect. Now, there's no question that where a lockdown doesn't allow people to go to work, and where, for example, factories are being told that you can start providing you can maintain social distance. Now, many of our factories are so crowded that it's virtually impossible to maintain social distance unless you cut the workforce down to 30 or 40%. So what are we going to do in that dimension also becomes important. I think when we start a recovery, that's why I said that, this year we're going to have negative 5%. And I mean, I still don't have an estimate from the government. What do they think? And, to my mind, I mean, they cannot make an assessment of the fiscal deficit without saying that the growth rate is going to be X or Y. So, I mean, there's a huge question mark on those things. I said 6.5 simply to say that, look, when we've got back to normal, we can't get back to 7+ quickly. So let's try to get to 6.5. What would it take? Well, I can give you a list of what it takes. One is, it's very clear, and I think on this there is complete agreement, everybody, that India needs a lot more infrastructure, okay? High quality infrastructure, better, more efficient infrastructure. And infrastructure is expensive, so who's going to produce this infrastructure? The government has a program which says that we are going to have some national investment pipeline, and some number has been given there. But the number assumes a certain amount coming from the private sector, a certain amount coming from the states, and a certain amount coming from the central government. Now, this projection of investment is not tied up with other projections which would be made consistent with the overall fiscal deficit. Now, for example, if we're going to end up this year with a central government fiscal deficit, almost certainly will be at least 6% of GDP. And we want to get back to maybe 3% of GDP in 2 or 3 years. We have to have a turnaround of about 3% of GDP just for the fiscal deficit to get back to square one. If in addition to that, we want to invest a lot more in infrastructure without increasing the fiscal deficit, then the turnaround needed is maybe 5% of GDP. Where is that going to come from? Now, in my view, a lot of that, some of that will come from wasteful expenditure being cut. But then we should create a public support for cutting wasteful expenditure. And what is that? Most of it has to come from much better tax revenues. Now, in my view, that is an untapped resource. Many studies have shown that given India's per capita income, we should be raising an extra 4 to 5% of GDP. So something's wrong with our tax system. It's not just the rates of tax, it's the method of administration of tax. The GST is a good example of a wonderful idea that has simply got mucked up in implementation. So how are we going to change that? Now, I have said in a different context that we should take a lesson out of the book of 1991 reforms, which I talk about in my book, Backstage. I don't know if you've read it, but it's meant for people of your generation, so I urge you to read it. And if you don't like it, send me an email saying it's all rubbish. In 1991, the government set up an expert committee headed by Raja Chellaya, including some of the top tax experts in the country, tax accountants, etc., to lay out a framework of tax reforms. Okay? I think we need to do that now. This cannot be done in secret within the government. There is no point in asking the finance ministry, which is responsible for the GST we've got, to go and reform the GST. Because as you can imagine, it's not human. People don't get up and say, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. They usually say that, look, that was absolutely right, but some little thing has caused the problem. We need a fresh look. We need an outside look. We need an expert look. And let the expert report be made public so that others can criticize. And I think if the government were to say, we've appointed this group, and any of you or your professors can tell you who would be the really respectable, non-political. I'm not, I don't think that the government necessarily has to consult political people, but non-political experts. Set up a committee, submit a report, and say that in the next budget, we promise you that we'll do everything which they say, which is sensible. It will raise confidence. But if we maintain the present secrecy, we won't get that. Now, let me give you one little example. Many businessmen will tell you that the worst thing about working in India is the unpredictability and the unreasonableness of tax assessments. Our tax rules are so vague and so badly drafted that they can be interpreted any way you like. Now, the present position I saw in the newspaper about a month ago, when there was a lot of talk that if the economy is going down, we won't be able to raise the tax revenues that we're talking about, that the Department of Revenue actually sent an instruction to all tax people, that the tax assessment officers, that your tax target remains the same. So this means that each of these guys is supposed to achieve, 13% increase in taxes, which is what, 13 or 14, whatever it was in the budget, even though the GDP is going to be much lower, and you would expect, therefore, that they'll raise less taxes. So obviously, what they're going to do is make unreasonable, high demand. This is an example of where lack of transparency. And I don't blame the official. I mean, if the official is told that, look, don't listen to all these people who say the GDP is becoming negative. You have to raise the same tax revenue. What do you expect?
They will maybe jack up the rates or come up with new taxes.
Yeah, you just interpret, don't allow this expense, that's not a valid expense. I mean, I have to end up assessing more. By the way, no tax official is ever held responsible if the taxes they levy are ultimately shot down through the appeals process. They're just held responsible for whatever they levied. So I think there's many businessmen, not foreign alone, foreign also, but Indian businessmen will also tell you, that are, compared to other countries, dealing with our tax authorities is hugely difficult. And I don't even blame the tax authorities if we don't actually have realistic assessments of how much money can be raised.
Also, this was like a demand side problem, but I think they came up with supply side issues to it, such as they reduced the corporate tax rate when I think it was not even required. Like not only the timing was off, but also I think it was not even required in the first place. So absolutely taxation is an issue.
Well, that was not in response to the COVID.
Yeah.
But let me say one, I agree with you that it's an open question, but many of us for a long time have said that we should lower our corporate taxes in order to be competitive with other countries. So personally, I don't mind the lowering of the corporate rate of tax. But I think the other taxes, the indirect, I think the biggest mistake has been in the way the GST has worked. Because we've got too many rates, we kept lowering the rates, and as a result, we're just not raising the funds that should have been raised by the GST.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Thank you, Sucharita.
Good.
I would like to tell all participants that all of you have been unmuted and you can post the questions. Any further questions to Dr. Singh? Okay.
Sorry, that's it?
It was wonderful, Dr. Singh.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.